Hello and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to spend a good part of this show tonight covering Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s historic presidential run announcement today. He gave his speech. He was in Boston. And I want to cover this because so many of the media outlets are not. They're just completely ignoring him, or they're smearing him, calling him the anti-vax candidate. They're spotlighting the fact that many in his family, the Kennedy family, are not in agreement with him and maybe even disapproving of his presidential run. They're doing what we all figured they would do, which is smear him. And so I want to take the time to actually spotlight his campaign and the things that he stands for, rather than all of this anti-vax nonsense that many of us who've been following Robert F. Kennedy Jr. knows is just him calling truth to power, ultimately, him calling out the corporate corruption that has been running rampant in our country. We know, for example, in the pandemic, that much of what was told to us was a lie, was untruthful, was meant to make big pharma like Pfizer billions upon billions of dollars rather than actually be for the benefit of the people. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is somebody who calls that out. But it's not just about the vaccines. He actually talks about a lot of issues that are facing the country. It's safe to say from listening to his speech that the campaign that he is running is not about the vaccine. It's not about the pandemic, but many of the issues that are plaguing America. So I want to play some clips from his speech if you missed it. It was a long one, 2 hours. Watch the whole thing. But let's just point out some of the highlights and some of what his presidential run is about. So let's start off with, he talks about what his mission is and how it is to end the corruption of state and corporate power. Watch this.
My mission over the next 18 months of this campaign and throughout my presidency will be to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is threatening now to impose a new kind of corporate feudalism on our country, to commoditize our children, our Purple Mountain's majesty, to poison our children and our people with chemicals and pharmaceutical drugs, to strip mine our assets, to hollow out the middle class, and keep us in a constant state of war.
See right there, that is why people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This is why he is growing in the polls. It is because he is calling out that corruption. He is calling out the fact that so much of our government is bought off by these big corporate interests that are no longer working on on behalf of the American people. His polling numbers, by the way, last week it was showing that he was at 10%. Now, he's running as a Democrat. That's my big criticism of him, is that he's running as a Democrat. He won't abandon the Democratic Party. I don't know why. They've abandoned him. But nonetheless, he's still running as a Democrat. And last week, he was polling at 10% of Democrat primary voters. Now, that's important because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is popular amongst people like myself who are independents and not going to vote in the Democratic primary. He is popular even amongst Republicans and libertarians. Libertarians love him. So he is getting a lot of people who are outside of the Democratic primary voting realm, but nonetheless, he was getting 10% last week. What is he getting this week? 14% of Biden voters would now be backing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That is big at this stage in the race. Those are really big numbers. So don't write this guy off. Don't think, oh, he doesn't stand a chance. I mean, it's not likely, right? It's not likely the Democratic Party is going to say, okay, no to Joe, and we're going to allow democracy and we're going to actually allow the voter to have a say. I think many of us know that the Democratic Party is probably not going to do that, but we can hope, and there's a possibility that he will grow to be too big to ignore. Now, he did mention his family. A lot of people are pointing, before we get more into the rest of his platform, and he had a lot to say about pollution, which is a distinction. Environmentalism is a distinction from climate. We'll get into that. He talks about harm, medical. He talks about the Ukraine war. He talks about a lot of different things, but he does touch on the fact that some members of his family are disapproving of him running. And I want to show you this.
There are other members of my family who are not here today. I'm going to make a confession because I know most American families, they never have any differences with each other. Oh, when one does, it's... So when that happens in a family, it's really huge news, like everywhere. And, but, you know, I want to just say this. I'm very grateful that many of the families who disagree with what I'm doing today, many of the family members have taken the time to write me beautiful letters of love this week, to send me emails, to make telephone calls to me. And I bear no ill will or any kind of disappointment to any of them. They have different views of the politics in this country. My whole family, including myself, have long personal relationships with President Biden. Many of my family members are working in the administration. Many of them also just plain disagree with me on issues like censorship, on war, on public health, and they are entitled to their beliefs, and I respect their opinions on them, and I love them back. And my hope...
So you might notice there that, which by the way, when he talks about his family, he says that they disagree with him on things like censorship and the war, and, you know, they just sound like straightforward neoliberal Democrats. Unfortunately, many in the Kennedy family seem to have gone down that path, and he has chosen a different path, and he's right. Many families don't agree. I don't agree with many family members of mine. They don't agree with me, and that's just the way it is. But in his family, it does make big news. One thing you probably saw in the background there are signs about being a Kennedy Democrat. So he is refusing to leave the Democratic Party. He's wanting to reform the Democratic Party. Not sure how possible that is, but I did want to bring up what Dennis Kucinich, now he spoke at the very beginning and he introduced Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Dennis Kucinich also, who has not left the Democratic Party, refuses to leave the Democratic Party, even though they've treated him like crap. He actually listed off what makes a Kennedy Democrat. And he says, a Kennedy Democrat protects the rights of working men and women. A Kennedy Democrat protects the Constitution of the United States. A Kennedy Democrat defends American civil liberties and the rights of all the people, believes in the power of diplomacy, meets adversity to seek unity, is unbought and unbossed, puts country ahead of self, and is looking to restore the Democratic Party and restore the United States of America, will work with Republicans and all Americans to bind our nation's wounds and come together. So he's saying that is what a Kennedy Democrat is. And I think there are a lot of people who would agree with many of the Kennedy Democrat platform who do not identify as Democrats. But again, are you going to be able to vote in the Democratic primary? I think that's kind of the big question that many of us have with him running as a Democrat, is then you've got to be a registered Democrat in many of the areas in order to vote in the Democratic primary. And I doubt there's going to be a lot of Republicans switching over who do like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who would absolutely vote for him for president. I don't know if, and I know some of them personally who are registered Republicans who are saying to me, I'm going to vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president. But they're not going to vote for him in the primary. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens as this campaign moves on. If he's going to then say, okay, fine, I'll run as an independent on an independent ticket, that's yet to be seen. Now, this is why he's really popular, and it's because he calls out the government's lies. And this is what Robert F. Kennedy has been doing throughout his entire career as an environmental attorney, which is different, again, from climate change. I want to say that again. Being an environmentalist is different than being a climate activist. Those are not the same thing. A lot of conservatives, a lot of conservative areas of the country are environmentalist areas. You've got states like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. They're big on nature, and they are environmental. They're environmentalists. They want clean air, clean water. They want nice, natural places to go and hang out. That is different than being a climate activist. So he has been an environmentalist his entire career, calling out the corruption in corporate greed, polluting our environment and getting away with it. he has called them out. He's been calling out Big Pharma, as we know. I think he's grown in popularity from that. He has been calling out their greed, that they're just really trying to make money and that they don't care about the people. That's what he was talking about as an environmentalist. He talks about, and so he's been calling this out. And now about war, same thing, calling all of this out for the longest time. A lot of it falls on deaf ears. Many of his family members have gone a different direction, as you know, in the Kennedy family. And so he has been calling out the government, and really at the expense of him, he could have lived an easy life as a Kennedy. He could be going to all the fancy parties and being revered as one of these, the great Kennedy in this way. But instead he gets smeared. He's like the black sheep in the family. Why? I don't know. He's the one person, I think, who embodies what we were all taught the Kennedys embodied. And when you study his father, when you study his uncle and how they called out these corrupt organizations, everybody thinks, well, they were killed because they called out the Fed, or they called out the wars, or they called out, XYZ thing. He is not afraid to do that. He has been doing that his entire career, and he does it again. I want you to watch this. It's a longer clip, but it's a really good one, talking about how our government just lies to us.
We have a polarization in this country today that is so toxic and so dangerous, and at any time since the Civil War. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said, a country or a nation, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And when I talk to both Republican friends and Democratic friends, they talk about this division in almost apocalyptical terms. Nobody can see a safe way or a good way out of it. And people are preparing for kind of a dystopian future. And one of the principal missions of my campaign and of my presidency is going to be to end that division. And I'm going to try to do that by encouraging people to talk about the values that we have in common rather than the issues that keep us apart. And also, and this I think is the most important thing, I'm going to do that by telling the truth to the American people. Because that is the core. That is the core of this division, of course. When we fight each other, when blacks fight whites and Republicans fight Democrats and rural fights urban, the people, that merger of corporate power that sits at the top, is loving the fighting between us, among us, so that they can strip mine our country. And the thing that keeps us, the reason truth is so important, when I was a little boy, nobody in this country would dream that our government would ever lie to the American people. In fact, and that's not a joke, nobody believed it back then. In May of 1960, that changed a little when Gary Powers crashes U-2 in Russia, and the Eisenhower administration denied that we had a U-2 program because they didn't know at the time that the Russians had captured Gary Powers. And when the Russians produced them, it was a shock to the American people that their government had lied to them. And then in 1970, during the Vietnam War, of course, we all began to suspect that we were being lied to. And in 71, when the Pentagon Papers came out, we realized, oh, this is what they do. My father, just before he died, told me very sadly, people in authority lie. And the government now lies to us. We all know it. We take it for granted. When my uncle left office when he died in 1963, about 80% of Americans said they trusted their government. Today, 22% trust their government, and 22% trust the press, the lowest level ever. the media is at the lowest nadir because we know the media lies to us now, and everybody knows that. And the problem is that when when there's sources of information that we're always used to and that we need to rely on in a democracy, when they start lying to us, Americans look for other sources because they know they're being lied to, and they look for other sources of the truth. And when the media and the corporate captive media and the corporate captive government sees other sources of truth, they have to brand those misinformation because they threaten their paradigm.
I think this is why he's going to be so popular as a candidate, is because he is really truly calling out what we all know. The government lies to us, and people are absolutely sick of it. The media lies to us, and we're sick of it. It is at an all-time low, 22%. And by the way, who are those 22%? Who are the 22% that trust the media and the government? Oh, the people who share the same narrative, right? The people who've been brainwashed. So they've only been able to brainwash 22%. I guess there's hope after all. He does talk about the lockdowns, and he actually blames Trump. Let's watch that.
But since the early 1980s, there's been a systematic attack on our middle class. And the coup de grace was the lockdown. The lockdown was the biggest shift in wealth in human history. And I'm going to tell you about that in a second. And I blame President Trump for the lockdown. Now, a lot of people say, and President Trump gets blamed for a lot of things that he didn't do, and he gets blamed for some things that he did do. But the worst thing that he did to this country, to our civil rights, to our economy, to the middle class in this country, was the lockdown. Now, President Trump, in fairness, let me just make this point, will tell people, well, the lockdown wasn't my idea. It was my bureaucrats rolled me on it. I was saying we shouldn't do it. But that's not a good enough excuse. He was the President of the United States.
I do think that there are some things that we could certainly hold Trump to account for, that where he was the president and he let his advisors steamroll over him, like, for example, on pardoning Julian Assange, or I don't even know if it would be a pardon because he hasn't even been charged with a crime. But you know what I mean, like letting Julian Assange free. But the lockdowns is kind of where it wasn't Trump, it wasn't the federal government that locked down. It was actually municipality by municipality, state by state. So it wasn't even Trump or his advisors who had any control over that. Maybe Robert F. Kennedy Jr. means the flights, the lockdowns of the international borders, not allowing people to fly in and out of the country. I'm not 100%, but I don't even know how long that lasted. So I'm a little unclear on that one. And if I get a chance to ask him, I would have him elaborate on that one. But certainly he is right. The lockdowns were the biggest crime against our society. Absolutely. The biggest crime against the people, the biggest crime against the middle class, the biggest crime against civil liberties, for sure. He talks about pollution. I think this is a really good clip from his speech, because I think this brings in a lot of conservatives, believe it or not, and this is on an environmental issue. Watch this.
God talks to human beings through many vectors, through each other, through organized religion, through the great books of those religions, through wise people, through art and music and literature and poetry, but nowhere with such detail and grace and color and joy as through creation. And when we destroy a species, when we destroy a special place, we're diminishing our capacity to sense the divine, understand who God is, and what our own potential is as human beings. Father Martin once told me that the definition of sin is an injury to another human being or to God, to our relationship with God. And when we eliminate, my children are going to grow up in a world where they will never see the kind of explosions of color from butterflies that I saw every time I walked into my garden. Because 80 or 90% of the butterflies are gone, the flying insects. They'll never hear the songbirds that I heard because 80% of them are gone. They'll never see the amphibians, the puddles that I saw as a boy, bubbling like cauldrons with tadpoles from salamanders and frogs. They're not going to see that in their lifetime. They're unaware of it. And it's like God is a tapestry and he's talking to us from all of these different vectors. And we're pulling threads out of that capacity. And it is such a crime against our children. And I think we deserve a president in this country who cares about these things and who talks about these things to the American people.
So having a clean environment, again, different from climate change. In fact, he's recently tweeted out when it comes to climate change, he says, quote, Gates' climate strategy is top-down social control and geoengineering projects for which he owns the IP. So he's very critical of the climate change agenda. But when it comes to environment, that is a different thing. And actually more and more conservatives are becoming more and more active with environmentalism. You see the East Palestine disaster. That's a lot of conservatives speaking about that. About the disaster of the air and the water. And a lot of these rural states are more interested in having those clean environments, wanting your children to see tadpoles and butterflies, for whatever reason, is increasingly a conservative viewpoint. And he talks about God in there. So I do think he's going to be pulling in a lot of those conservatives. But again, he's running as a Democrat. You got to be able to vote in the Democrat primary. So I do want to, the Ukraine war one, this is a big one. He talks about this. And I want to point out that, now this is a longer clip, but the reason I feel it's important to see the entire part of his speech about Ukraine, he has, I think, the best, he talks about the Ukraine war better than anyone I've seen. He is able to bring both sides together with his viewpoint on the Ukraine war. And I think he does it in a way that is the best I have yet to see anyone talk about this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So watch this.
I want to talk about the war in Ukraine. And we need to have a national conversation about this war. We need to have a mature conversation that allows for nuance and that allows for complexity, and we need to do it respectfully. We can't be telling one side that they're Nazis and the other side that they love Putin. Everybody in this country loves our country, and we have to respect differences of opinion, and we have to respect the people's capacity to ask questions. And some of the issues that we need to talk about is, number one, is this war in the U.S. national interest? We just need to isolate that question. Is it in the U.S. national interest? And there are, some of the leading pangerums of most respected people of our national diplomats, let's say Henry Kissinger, Jack Matlock, Larry Wilkinson, who's Colin Powell's chief of staff, they all have said definitively, if you just want to ask, is it in our national interest? It is not. It is not in America's national interest to push Russia closer to China. That is a cataclysm. Number two, it's not in our national interest to do something that could involve us in a nuclear exchange with a country that has more nuclear weapons than us. Now, having said that, I want to say that we are in the Ukraine for all the right reasons. We are there because we are a good people. And, Abraham Lincoln said, America is a great nation because we're a good nation. And we continue to be a good people. And we are there because of our compassion for the Ukrainian people who have been brutalized, who have been illegally invaded, and have shown extraordinary valor and courage defending their country and defending, their families and their beliefs and their liberties and their independence, things that Americans have to admire. My own son, Connor, I'm very, very proud that Connor joined the Foreign Legion and fought in the Ukraine and during the Kharkiv offensive as a machine gunner for a special forces group. But I think that we need to know as Americans, and we have a right to know, what is our government's chief objective in this war? Now, we were told initially that the objective was humanitarian. And that is a good reason to be there, a humanitarian. And what that means is trying to end the bloodshed and minimize it as much as possible. But in recent times, President Biden said that one of our objectives, at least, is regime change of Vladimir Putin. And this is the same strategy that did not work well for us in Iraq. And it's many of the same people who are around the neocons, who are around President Biden, who have been talking about that for a long time and have been engaged in geopolitical machinations in the Ukraine since 2014. And then President Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, validated President Biden's statement by saying that our objective in the Ukraine is to exhaust and degrade the Russian army so they're incapable of having battles anywhere else in the world. Now, and indeed, many of the steps that we've taken in the Ukraine have seemed to indicate that our interest is in prolonging the war rather than shortening it. So if those are our objectives, to have regime change and exhaust the Russians, that is completely antithetical to a humanitarian mission. If we're there for a humanitarian mission, it means to reduce bloodshed and bring an end to the war quickly. If we're there to exhaust the Russians or regime change, then doesn't it mean that the Ukraine is just a pawn in a geopolitical battle between two great superpowers, and that our strategy is to put the flower of Ukrainian youth into an abattoir of death in order to exhaust Russia?
So I think he just really is able to have compassion for Ukrainians and what they're going through, while at the same time criticizing the war. And I think it's an important way that he's doing it. So you can't call him a Putin puppet or a Russian asset the way that he's speaking about this. It is the way a president should be approaching these foreign entanglements, these foreign wars. And he really, I think, just does a phenomenal job. We can all, many of us who are very critical of the war, could take note on how he goes about approaching it. And the language he uses, I think that was absolutely fantastic. Best I've seen. Now, he does finish off his speech by saying he wants to take back the country. Watch this.
When I'm president, I'm going to be president for those people. We're going to really take back this country. You give me a piece of ground and a sword, and I am going to take back this country with your help, the help of all the homeless Republicans and Democrats and independents who are Americans first. Thank you all very much.
So there he says it, even for all those homeless Republicans, independents, Democrats, he's going to take back this country. You give him a sword, He is going to take back the country. Really excellent speech. If you want to take the time to watch the entire thing, really excited to be covering his campaign on this show. I will be doing that. And look, I will be critical of him where criticism is needed. My biggest criticism right now is he's running as a Democrat. That's what I keep saying. And I think, at the end of this, if inevitably Joe Biden ends up again with the nomination, but of course anything could happen, anything could change, and Joe Biden may not end up running. He might not, who knows what's going to happen. But in the end, the one piece of advice, if I were to give Robert F. Kennedy Jr. a piece of advice, my one piece would be, in the end, do not, under any circumstances, concede and say, I give my support to Joe Biden. That is the worst thing he could possibly do, is to say, okay, that's it. Joe Biden's the guy, like every Democrat did in the 2020 race. They all sat back, well, okay, Joe Biden, after criticizing him, calling him a racist, going after him hard. What did they end up doing? I support Joe Biden. Don't do it. Big mistake. When they inevitably give the nomination to Joe Biden, ignoring the massive support that my guess is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will have gained at that time. He will be massive. People will be loving him. He very well may be the most popular candidate in the race, but it still does not guarantee he actually ends up with a nomination with the way Democrats are. So in the end, do not endorse Joe Biden. Instead, say, that's it. I'm running as an independent. So best of luck to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We will be talking more about his campaign as the time goes on. And hopefully, again, to him on this show, we'll hopefully have another sit-down interview with him and really pick his brain about his policies and his platform that he proposes for the American people. All right, millions of Americans' retirement plans may be in jeopardy due to China and Russia replacing the U.S. dollar with their own gold-backed reserve currency. For years, they told us not to worry, that there's no way the U.S. dollar will be replaced by another global currency. But now that narrative is shifted, and we're seeing segments on both CNN and Fox News discussing what happens when the dollar gets replaced. Bad things. Spoiler alert. Both networks conclude it won't be good. There will be record levels of inflation, a crash in stock prices, a drastic decline in the real-world value of IRAs and 401ks, corrupt lobbying and banking. They're going to be forcing Americans to cover their losses through bail-ins. But you can protect yourself from these potential outcomes by diversifying your investments into physical assets such as gold and silver. With a self-directed physical gold IRA, for example, you can easily transfer your retirement funds into precious metals without incurring fees, penalties, or taxes. To find out more, visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit.